We continue our study of John, and we are in John, the 11th chapter, I do believe. I think that's where we left off last time. We ended chapter 10. And now we're coming into what I consider to be the most dramatic aspect of Jesus' earthly ministry. Save, of course, the events surrounding and leading up to the crucifixion. This that we're about to read is probably, if you want to consider it in terms of a movie, which there have been many movies made of Jesus' life, of course, but if you want to consider it in that kind of outlook, this is perhaps the most dramatic point in the entirety of Jesus' earthly ministry that we're about to enter into. And if you read it in that light, and if you detach yourself from what we know now, in other words, looking at it from our 21st century perspective, looking at the Scriptures, what it all says, knowing what we know about all the rest of the Gospels and, of course, the rest of the New Testament, if you simply try to place yourself in those events as they unfolded, I think you can get some sort of a taste of the dramatic moment that we're about to see, especially when we come to the events surrounding the crucifixion, leading up to and including the crucifixion. If you place yourself in the shoes of the apostles, for example, or if you place yourself in the shoes of those that simply were casual observers that were watching all of this unfold, you can sort of get in your mind and in your emotional makeup some sort of a picture of the high drama that was going to take place. The apostles knew what Jesus had told them, obviously, but as these things unfolded, as we are going to see, they were simply human beings. They didn't have the knowledge that we have now looking back. And so they didn't know how all this was going to play out. All they knew was what Jesus had told them, and they did not completely understand that. So I think if we detach ourselves from what we know from the Scriptures and try to place ourselves then, I think we can get some better understanding of what's going on. And here in John chapter 11, as you see these things unfold in connection with Lazarus, I think you're going to pick up a little bit on the power play in as far as the Pharisees are concerned that's unfolding. And then on a far grander scale, what's going on between Jesus and the power of the devil. So we're going to see all this transpire here in chapter 11. It begins, "Now a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary, and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick." We've already seen Mary and Martha earlier. And now we see them in connection with this. We're told a little bit more about Mary and Martha from the apostle. He says that Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. Now this has not happened yet. What he's describing here won't take place until chapter 12. We're going to see all of that happen at the beginning of chapter 12. But John is setting up all of this. He's telling us who she is. And it's also telling the brethren to whom this is written who this Mary is. Mary was a very common name in the first century among the Jews. Just like David is a common name today and John is a common name, and it was then, Mary was a very common name. You have Mary Magdalene, you have this Mary, you have other Marys. You've got to distinguish them. And so this is who he's identifying. And so Mary and Martha had the brother Lazarus who was sick. And we're not told the nature of his illness. We're not told how long he had been sick. It's just he was sick. Therefore his sister sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. Simple message. He whom you love. That word love is from the word phileo. Philane is the actual word that's used here. And it's been said, and I think more is made of this than really exists, that phileo is the friendship love and agape is the higher form of Christian love. I won't go into detail. There's more made of that distinction than there really exists in the New Testament. I'll just leave it at that for another time to talk about more detail. Still, in the context here, is talking about the fact that he loves him as a friend. And so, he whom you love is sick. There's a close intimacy. Jesus is closer to certain people than he is to others, just as is the case with the disciples. The 12 apostles, all of them were his friends, quite obviously. But then there was an inner circle of apostles, the 3 apostles, that were with Jesus on certain occasions, separate from the rest. And then there is that apostle whom Jesus loved. Not that he didn't love the others. It's just he was closest to one in particular than the rest. And by process of elimination, by adduction process, we find out that that apostle whom Jesus loved is John the apostle. The only apostle that's not mentioned by name in this gospel, because it is he who is writing this book. So, this Lazarus is another close friend of Jesus. When Jesus heard that, verse 4, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby." That's an interesting statement to make. This sickness is not unto death. Well, he's sick. But it's for the glorification of the Son of God. Because of the miracle of the resurrection, this would be the case. Verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now that word for love there in verse 5 is the word agapon, from agapao or agape. Well, again, context determines meaning. This is a deep love, but it's not the Christian love as we have been told over the years. As I myself have said on occasion in years gone by, context determines meaning. And this love is a deep, close love, yes. But in reality, as far as making a big distinction between phileo and agape in this text, really doesn't exist that much. Verse 6, when he had heard therefore that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. That's unusual in our way of thinking. Here's a close friend whom you hear is sick. His sisters say, "He whom you love is sick." They're obviously wanting him to come. They think they could possibly heal him. And yet Jesus stays in the city for 2 days. Now why does he do that? He's withholding the blessing that he will give, so that when the time comes, that blessing would be enlarged even more, as we're going to see. Verse 7, then after that saith he to his disciples, "Let us go into Judea again." His disciples say unto him, "Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee." End of chapter 10. Remember, they tried to kill him. "And goest thou thither again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him." Jesus was telling them, I'm not afraid to carry out my mission. I'm not afraid. That's not the reason, you see. And so, verse 9, he says, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? I thought there were 24 hours in the day." Well, Jesus is talking about the daytime, obviously. 12 hours in the day, on an average. 12 hours of daylight. He's talking about the contrast between daylight and dark. And then, verse 11, "These things said he, and after that he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. Then said his disciples, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well." They don't understand what he's saying. Howbeit Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking of rest and sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Jesus tries to couch death in terms that takes the sting out of it. Our friend Lazarus sleeps. Now, certain of our religious friends today try to uphold the doctrine of soul sleep. That's not anywhere taught in the New Testament, and is not taught by Jesus here. He clearly says, verse 14, Lazarus is dead. So when he says sleep, and we can also deduce that when the apostles talking about sleep in connection with death, that's what they're talking about is death. It is a term, a figurative term that couches death in terms that we can really take without the hard-nosed sting of it hitting us. And that's what he's doing here. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there. To the intent you may believe, nevertheless, let us go unto him. Jesus is glad for their sakes, because he would have lost a golden opportunity to demonstrate once and for all that he is the Son of God. But not only that, he would have healed Lazarus if he was in the same town. If Lazarus was sick and he was there, he would have gone ahead and healed him. But yet he knew that if he withheld it for 2 days, a greater miracle could be performed. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus. By the way, that word Didymus means a twin. Thomas was a twin, in other words. Unto his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Still don't understand it. He still doesn't get it here. He's got little faith, yes. He's wanting to die with him, yes. But he's not fully understanding the big picture of what Jesus is trying to get across. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. He'd been in the grave for 4 days. Now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem. About, the King James says, 15 furlongs off. That's about 1 7/8 miles, almost 2 miles from Jerusalem. Doesn't sound like a far travel at all to us, but to them it was. Because you have to walk it. Walking 2 miles. And anytime you go to any place from Jerusalem, you're literally going down, because Jerusalem is on an elevated area. You have to go down anywhere you go, north, south, east, west. So it's about 2 miles from Jerusalem. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Knowing the customs of the day, those who comforted family members who had people who had passed on, they would stay with them for several days and mourn with them. Some people were paid in these days to mourn. They would pay certain people to cry over the body. That seems morbid to us, but sometimes families wouldn't have many people who were friends and neighbors that knew the person. So that was provided for those kinds of circumstances. But in this case, these were friends and neighbors and relatives that knew the family. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. Isn't that typical? It's typical of Martha, isn't it? But Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Can't you hear the sorrow in her voice? Can't you hear the little bit of pain in her voice? She thought she was disappointed in Jesus. She thought that when they sent for him, that he would be right there and that he would heal him. But he didn't come for 2 days. Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. She had a vague or elusive hope. Jesus, you can do something. I know that you can do something. She had no idea what Jesus was going to do. Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Now, according to our friends that believe in the 80-70 doctrine, that's not what Martha should have said. When Jesus said, "Thy brother shall rise again," Martha should have said, "Well, Lord, I know that the resurrection is not going to take place until 80-70 when the Romans come and besiege Jerusalem." No, that's not what Jesus said. "I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day." No intimation that Martha had any clue of any so-called 80-70 theory, because it didn't exist. No one believed in that. The Sadducees rejected the bodily resurrection. Obviously, Martha accepted the bodily resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this?" Again, according to our 80-70 friends, what Jesus should have said in response to Martha was, "No, Martha, you're misunderstanding the nature of the resurrection. It's not a literal bodily resurrection. You see, it's when Titus comes with his Roman armies in 80-70, besieges Jerusalem. It's a resurrection of a..." No, that's not what Jesus said. "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this?" Believest thou this? That question echoes through the years, does it not? It still rings clear today. Do you believe this? Do you believe in the resurrection? There are those today that reject it still. Not just our 80-70 friends, but those outside of any sort of religious group that deny the inspiration of the Scriptures, that deny the miracles of the Bible, that deny the deity of Christ. They reject this when Jesus asked that question. She saith unto him, "Yea, Lord, I believe," literally, "I have believed, that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world." She has that foundation belief in Jesus. Still was not complete faith, quite obviously, but yet she has that belief that He is from God, that He can do more, much more than any individual could. And when she had so said, verse 28, she went her way and called Mary her sister secretly, saying, "The Master is come and calleth for thee." Now, get the picture. Martha goes into the house, goes where Mary is, and it says that she called her secretly. You can see her. "The Master's come," whispering, "The Master's come and calls for you." Martha's getting her sister up, get in here, see Jesus. And so Mary could talk to him. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came unto him. There's that ardent feeling that exists there between the sisters and Jesus. Now, Jesus was not yet come into the town, but was in that place where Martha met him. He was taking his time coming to the place. The Jews then, which were with her in the house and comforted her, when they saw Mary, that she rose up hastily and went out, followed her, saying, "She goeth unto the grave to weep there." That's the custom of mourners. They're going to follow the person who's mourning. We're going to follow her and mourn with her. It seems strange to our mentality, but yet that's the custom. Then when Mary was come where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." The same thing that was said by Martha is now mentioned by Mary. And in her grief, in her pain, she cries out to Jesus. She's calling out to the right person. She's calling out to the right source of authority. But she doesn't fully understand either. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and all the Jews also and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Why was he groaning in the spirit? Why was he troubled at them weeping? Mary and Martha weeping, the Jews who were weeping with her. Why was he troubled at that? Why was he groaning in the Spirit? There have been reasons, speculations given. To me, the one that makes the most sense is that Jesus was groaning about the reality of what sin does. Sin brought about this condition. Sin brought about death and pain and suffering. Jesus was groaning in himself. He was groaning in himself and troubled. He was troubled at all of the misery and the pain and agony that Satan brought in when he caused, or when he tempted Adam and Eve successfully to sin and brought death and pain and suffering. And said, "Where have you laid him?" They said unto him, "Lord, come and see." He said that, of course, to bring everyone to the tomb. And then, verse 35, the shortest English verse in our Bible, one of the shortest Greek verses in the New Testament, simply says, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Such a short phrase, yet such a profound phrase when you think of the humanity of our Lord. He was weeping. That is to say, he wasn't making a big show of it, where he was wailing and crying out. He wouldn't do that until the Garden of Gethsemane, by the way, in private, for more profound reasons. But here he's weeping. He's crying. It's quiet tears. Why was he weeping? Well, then said the Jews, "Behold, how he loved him." They think it's all because of how close he was to Lazarus that he's weeping because he's gone. Well, again, they don't know what's about to happen. Jesus is weeping over what sin has brought about to the human family. He is weeping over what Satan has done to God's creation. He's weeping over all of that. Verse 37, and some of them said, "Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died?" Ah, there you go. Human nature. He could have kept this from happening. You know, they're talking among themselves in the midst of all of this. Jesus, therefore, again groaning in himself. Perhaps now he's groaning in himself over these people that are fussing and complaining. Cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. This stone was a large grindstone. If you're familiar with the tombs that were in place in the first century, you know that in this case there would be a large stone at the mouth of the cave, and it would have a scotch underneath it to keep it in its place. And then when they wanted to roll away the stone, they would remove the scotch and it would roll down a trench down to the bottom where gravity would take care of it. It would roll down to its resting spot, and then if they wanted to reseal it, they would roll the stone back up and scotch it again, and perhaps even seal it to make sure that it's not tampered with. So this grave is a cave with a stone laying upon it. Jesus said, "Take ye away the stone." Take ye away the stone. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days." Now I'm sure we're not told how she said it, but in my mind I get her going up to him and saying, "Lord, by this time he stinketh. You know, he's been in the grave 4 days." Well, you see the purpose of why Jesus delayed his coming now? He wanted there to be no doubt as to what's about to take place. Jesus saith unto her, "Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God?" In other words, you're about to see something amazing take place. Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. And I knew that thou hearest me always. But because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. He's praying a prayer of thanksgiving to the Father for what's about to take place. To prove his claim as to who he was, yes. And it's not for show, but it's to induce faith in the people that are eyewitnesses of this. By the way, that phrase, take you away or roll you away the stone, verse 39, that makes a good sermon. Brother Gus Nichols had a sermon, Roll Away the Stone. And I'm sure some of us, many of us have preached something similar to that. It preaches. Well, verse 43, when he thus had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. He cries with a loud voice, indicating his personal authority over the dead. And he also says, Lazarus, come forth, because as Brother Marshall Keeble used to say, if he had just said come forth, all the graves in Jerusalem would have opened up. That's how powerful Jesus was. Very possible. He specifies, however, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus saith unto them, Loose him and let him go. Picture this in your mind for a moment. Everyone is standing there watching this happen. Jesus is standing in front of the grave. He cries out, Lazarus, come forth, in a loud voice. And all of a sudden, at the mouth of the tomb, there comes a body. And this body is bound, as John says, from head to foot. Part of the miracle was the fact that Lazarus did not walk out of the tomb. The movies that you see depict Lazarus walking out. No, He was bound hand and foot. Head to foot, that is. And his head was wrapped with a napkin. He could not walk on his own power. He was wrapped up tight. Jesus brought him forth. And many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. They unwrapped Lazarus, and there he is. He's alive. He had been in the grave for 4 days. His body had begun to decompose, and there he is, as good as new, alive. Jesus had raised him from the dead. But some of them went their ways to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. Here's a new cause for alarm. Now, here is the critical time for the Pharisees. If any of the Pharisees were going to step forward and advocate for Jesus being the Son of God, this would be the time. If the Pharisees were going to turn away from their ungodly actions to try to kill Jesus, this would be the time. We would think in our minds that the Pharisees that heard about this miracle and knew that Lazarus was now alive after being dead for 3 days, certainly the Pharisees would now come to believe in Jesus. But now see what happens. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, What do we? For this man doeth many miracles. They don't deny in this council, in this meeting, that Jesus is doing many miracles. How could they deny it? They don't deny the fact. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. How infantile that thinking is. How infantile. In other words, they are more concerned with their position, they're more concerned with their power than they are with who Jesus really is. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, You know nothing at all. Oh, Caiaphas is going to have all the answers now, see. Caiaphas, oh, you don't know anything. Here, let me tell you the story. This is how it's going to be. This guy is the head honcho, in other words. He's high priest. He said, I'm in a position where I can tell you exactly how it's going to be. Nor can it consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Oh, you see, he's got it all figured out. Oh, we kill this one man. That takes care of the situation. The whole nation doesn't perish. They're thinking that Jesus is going to be an earthly king with an earthly kingdom. Well, no. He said, we're not going to have that problem. He's going to die and the whole nation won't perish. Notice what John says. And this spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. Now, is John saying that Caiaphas prophesied with the power of the Holy Spirit? No. Caiaphas is prophesying in spite of himself. He's saying what's going to happen, and he's not realizing the full impact, the full truth of the words that he's saying. And not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. Caiaphas didn't intend to say that when he said those words, but yet what he said in a large picture actually did take place. Then from that day forth they took counsel together for to put him to death. The late Rex Turner Sr., in a chapter of his book, Systematic Theology, dealt with the trial of Jesus, the greatest miscarriage of justice in history. I don't know if you've ever studied the trial of Jesus from a Jewish legal standpoint, but it is unbelievable how many of their own laws the Jews violated, the Pharisees that is, that the Pharisees violated in putting Jesus on trial, quote unquote, and then condemning him to death. And the process, the illegal process, starts right here. Without a hearing, they began to take counsel among themselves to put Jesus to death. Without a charge, they bring on themselves what they want to avoid, in other words. That's what they're bringing upon themselves. Caiaphas doesn't want the Romans to come in. Well, what he's doing is bringing the Romans in eventually, in spite of himself. Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but went thence unto a country near to the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples. Ephraim is about 16 miles northeast of Jerusalem. And the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand. And many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. This is a ceremonial purification to take care of any uncleanness that they might have. Then sought they for Jesus, and spake among themselves as they stood at the temple. Why think ye that he will not come to the feast? In other words, will he dare come to the feast now? Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment that if any man knew where he were, he should show it, that they might take him. Now get in your mind this picture. Lazarus has now been raised from the dead the week before Jesus will be crucified, because we're near the Passover. The events that take place beginning in chapter 12 are Friday prior to the week of the Passover, when Jesus would be crucified. So we're getting now right up to the climax of this grand drama that's playing itself out. This cosmic drama, if you want to put it in those kinds of terms. This universal drama that has an impact on all human beings who have ever lived, who now live, and who ever will live. All these things are now beginning to show themselves. Chapter 12 begins, "Then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover," again this is Friday afternoon, "came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead." In other words, he's going to spend the Sabbath day with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. He's doing this to purposely provoke the Sanhedrin. He's already been telling his disciples, if you read Matthew and Mark's account and Luke's account, he's been telling the disciples that he must suffer many things of the chief priests and scribes and must be killed. He's been telling them this all this time leading up to these events. So he's now doing all this to bring all this about. There they made him a supper. It is after sunset on Saturday, obviously. And Martha served. But Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Have you ever thought how that looked? You're sitting there at the table eating a meal, and here sits Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days, and now he's raised from the dead. What kind of dinner conversation do you have? Well, we're not told, obviously. But still, think about that. Jesus is sitting there eating supper with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, you know that Lazarus will once again die. All those who were raised from the dead up to this point would die again. Jesus, however, would be the first fruits of the resurrection of the dead, raised from the dead to die no more. Yes, sir. God gave them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity, just as He did with the Israelites and those in the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. All the way up to 586 BC, when He took His presence away from the temple and Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed the temple. The prophets gave opportunity after opportunity to the people to repent. God begged them to repent. And as you're saying here, there's going to be more opportunities leading up to the very day or two before the crucifixion. When Jesus delivers His sermon in Matthew 23 to the Pharisees, calling them hypocrites and whited walls, He's not doing it simply to write them off. He's trying to finally shake them to the point where they would repent, and yet they refuse. He gives them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to change. And some do. Nicodemus, of course, and Joseph of Arimathea being the two notable ones who would. And yet, God's grace is extended. His love is extended. After all of these things the Pharisees are doing, after all these things the scribes are doing, He's still giving them opportunity. Matthew's account tells us that this was in the house of Simon the leper. So they're in the house of Simon the leper when these things happen. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly. This is liquid perfume with oil from the Far East. Very expensive. And anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped His feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Mark says that she broke the cruse that it was contained in, and poured it upon Jesus' head. You can imagine after she broke the seal that all of a sudden the fragrance fills the whole house, and she pours it on Jesus. Then saith one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? He cared nothing for the poor, obviously, as John is going to tell us, because he was a thief and had the bag and bare what was put therein. Matthew even says the disciples murmured against her. It wasn't just Judas. The disciples murmured against what she had done. Matthew also records, why trouble ye? In other words, why are you troubling him? They don't like what she's done. Then said Jesus, let her alone. Against the day of my burying, hath she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always. Jesus' body had to be prepared for the burial. And Mary indeed did that. Very appropriate. That Jesus has this very expensive perfume poured upon him. And now he is fragrant. A sweet savor. A sweet offering that is going to be made in the sight of God when all of this happens. Jesus is saying there's going to be plenty of opportunities to help the poor. You'll have plenty of opportunities. Poor you have with you always. But me you have not always. They only had about 7 days at most. Less than that really until Jesus would die. In other words, make sure you make the most out of every opportunity that you have with me. Much people of the Jews therefore knew that he was there, for they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death, because that by reason of him many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. Can you imagine in your mind the hatred that these men have for Jesus? That they would actually put to death someone that he had raised from the dead? Can you get in your head this kind of animosity, this kind of anger? Yet it was there. They were more concerned with their power base. They were more concerned with their position than they were with truth. Sadly, you've got that same mentality today quite often in religion. More concerned with your base, more concerned with your power, more concerned with your position than you are with truth. Allow truth to guide you where it leads. Not man's speculations, not man's doctrines, but the truth of God. That's what we've got to always keep at the forefront. They weren't willing to do that. We need to have the opposite mentality. So they wanted to kill Lazarus along with Jesus. They succeeded in doing that to Jesus. They weren't successful in keeping him down. We are never told what happens to Lazarus in the Scriptures after this. We have to think that they were not successful in putting Lazarus to death because of the events that would transpire, obviously. But yet, the scribes and Pharisees are not willing to follow him. They're not willing to do what it takes to follow after God. They pay lip service to following God, yet they're not willing to do what needs to be done to really follow him. If they really wanted to follow God, they would have bowed their knees before Jesus and confessed him as the risen Lord. This is where we'll leave off this morning. We'll take up